We will now proceed with the nominator presentations. We have two presentations, Dr. A.J. Day, who is speaking on behalf of National Community Pharmacists Association and Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding, followed by Dr. Richard E. Fry, who is speaking on behalf of Professional Compounding Centers of America. Dr. Day.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're listening in from. I do not have the red bar that gives me control over the slides. Okay, thank you very much. Well, good day, and thank you for inviting me to speak to this committee today. My name is A.J. Day. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Services at PCCA. I serve on the board of the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding and with the NTPA Compounding Committee. And I'd like to express my gratitude to begin with to the FDA for hosting this virtual meeting, which in this format allows for greater participation from stakeholders, particularly physicians, than we have had in the past. Our nomination is specifically focused on patients with autism spectrum disorders. We will not be presenting on other nominated uses. I'd like to start by addressing this excerpt from FDA's analysis, stating that it is not clear that methylcobalamin provides a unique benefit over other vitamins of B12 that are FDA approved. This statement should actually be flipped around. There is no evidence that other vitamins of B12 are safe or effective in patients with autism spectrum disorders. All clinical literature for the use of B12 in patients with ASD focus on the use of methylcobalamin. To remove this option and suggest that patients and providers should use cyanocobalamin or hydroxycobalamin, which, as Dr. Johnson pointed out, are not naturally occurring in humans, while methylcobalamin is, will force clinicians to experiment on these patients. There is no data to guide dosing, no data on safety, no data on clinical outcomes using these other vitamins, not even anecdotal data. FDA discusses the process for activating exogenously administered cobalamins. This process relies on fully functioning gastrointestinal lining, transport proteins, and intrinsic factor. Dr. Johnson did an excellent job of walking us through all of that process. A hallmark feature for many patients with ASD is compromised gut and intestinal health and sensitivity to proteins and foods. Therefore, oral absorption of cobalamins may not be the same in ASD patients. Data assessed by Paul and Brady 2017, as referenced by FDA, as well as their reference citations, does not explore altered gastrointestinal health or function in patients with ASD. Now, Paul and Brady actually acknowledge that very point in their paper shown in this excerpt on your screen, where patients with impaired production of intrinsic factor, such as autoimmune pernicious anemia or atrophic gastritis, and or a compromised intestinal absorptive function, as in celiac disease, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, or tropical sprue, may greatly impair B12 absorption by endocytosis. The research provided by Johns Hopkins University acknowledges their perspective of only using methylcobalamin to address vitamin deficiencies and therefore predominantly utilizing oral dosing. Given the altered GI status of this patient population, it is unsurprising that patients generally do not show significant improvement in that environment. Presentations by Dr. Fry and Dr. Newbrander later today will address the biochemical and clinical reasons for subcutaneous dosing of methylcobalamin is preferred for patients with ASD. It is also important to acknowledge that detailed reviews by FDA and Johns Hopkins did not identify significant safety concerns. There are many trials published for various potential uses, including ASD, and FDA states that adverse events reported with methylcobalamin use are infrequent and non-serious. Methylcobalamin is an approved product as an injection in both Japan and Australia. Safety data from the Japanese product indicates an adverse reaction rate of 0.45%. The product warns of potential anaphylactoid reactions, though no such reactions have been documented. Similar data is on the Australian product label. Additionally, Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration has a searchable database of adverse event notifications for medicines. Searching for all single-ingredient methylcobalamin reactions from January 1, 1991 through March 1, 2021, There are no results for adverse reactions related to the injectable product. There are 4 non-serious case reports related to oral formulations with no details provided for other health conditions or medications that patients may have had. Therefore, causality cannot be determined. Several publications are available which report adverse events. This first portion of the table lists articles which assessed subcutaneous methylcobalamin in patients with ASD. This next slide includes other indications that were studied. This data is included as extra data on the safety profile of injected methylcobalamin, even when used IV at relatively high doses at a frequency that exceeds the commonly utilized dosing schedule for ASD. Articles highlighted in yellow were not included in FDA's bibliography. Dosing in blue highlights milligram as opposed to microgram dosing protocols. Here we have additional studies, and when we look at the totality of the data from all of these trials in these 3 slides, with their combined 531 weeks of trial data, the only serious adverse events were identified in the trial for ALS, and those were not attributed to the methylcobalamin therapy. When we consider therapies for patients with ASD, we must remember that these patients receive high-frequency, in-depth medical supervision with a multimodal care approach. Current clinical trial designs are generally ill-suited to measure changes in core symptoms of ASD. This article from the National Institute of Mental Health states that the gold standard diagnostic instruments were not created to measure severity or improvement of the disorder, and they do not holistically and comprehensively measure changes in core symptom domains. FDA does point out that there are no approved drugs to treat the core symptoms of ASD, and the only 2 drugs approved to treat symptoms of irritability associated with autism have significant adverse events, including EPS. An informal survey of compounders 2 weeks ago reports that 24 pharmacies responded as dispensing compounded methylcobalamin to a combined 27,565 patients in the last 12 months. 662,000 milliliters of compounded methylcobalamin was dispensed by those pharmacies to those patients in that 12-month time period, keeping in mind that the typical dose is 0.1 mLs. This request in the survey was specific for data representing patients with ASD. Medicaid data on utilization of methylcobalamin provided by Johns Hopkins research is not informative. Prescription claims for compounded methylcobalamin are unlikely to be submitted to CMS because CMS generally does not reimburse for it. Surveys by University of Maryland and JHU key opinion leaders are severely limited, and no physicians that we have spoken with were contacted by either research organization. We have no information about how physicians were selected to participate or why the numbers of physicians selected were so few. In May of 2017, FDA hosted a patient-focused drug development meeting for autism. This URL listed on the slide takes you directly to the transcript of that meeting, where FDA officials, physicians, family and caretakers of patients with autism and autism spectrum disorders discuss the shortfalls of clinical trial designs for this patient population, the impact of methylcobalamin injections, and various FDA-approved products and therapies. Here we have a screenshot of a comment that is submitted to the public docket from a physician specializing in chronic illness in children and adults with ASD. I hope you all have the opportunity to read this and the multitudes, hundreds of other comments that were submitted. This is simply highlighting a specific comment within the previous slide that discusses the biochemical pathways that injected methylcobalamin addresses in the patients that he treats. I'm limited on time for this presentation, so I will not be reading the specific comments and the details of that. Similarly, Dr. Buckley points out specific clinical outcomes achieved with injected methylcobalamin. Additionally, the Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs identifies compounded injectable methylcobalamin as a standard of care. In conclusion, injectable methylcobalamin is commercially available in Japan and Australia. There are no significant adverse events identified from global literature searches, and FDA states that adverse events reported with methylcobalamin use are infrequent and non-serious. It has been compounded since at least 2005. There are no alternative options for patients with ASD. Denying methylcobalamin from the 5038 bulks list will eliminate therapy for thousands of patients where no significant safety risk has been identified. There are no products, FDA approved or otherwise, that address the core symptoms of ASD to even the same degree as compounded methylcobalamin reported in the presentation from Dr. Johnson. As Ms. Bormel stated in her introductory remarks, the goal of this process is to protect the public from unsafe compounded drugs while maintaining patient access to needed compounded therapies. No evidence has been presented to establish compounded methylcobalamin as unsafe, and there are significant numbers of patients who need continued access to this therapy. Dr. Fry will address the clinical and biochemical assessment. Thank you very much.